Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us in this webinar entitled Social Innovation Talks, Sustainable Designs Through Digital Tech. I won't keep you guys waiting any further. Please join me in welcoming our speaker for today. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sir Gideon Catalan.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Pat. And thank you for having me here. Good afternoon, everyone. And welcome. My name is Gideon, and I'm with Accelerating Makers as a solutions architect. In Accelerating Makers, our objective is to take digital fabrication technologies and share them around the Philippines. We want to contact schools, institutions, hobbyists, even businesses, and encourage this air of innovation using these technologies. And part of that is also understanding when we're looking at these technologies, how can we do it in a way that is safe, in a way that's sustainable? Because for many of us, we know that sustainability and impact to the ecosystem is a very big part and a very big factor on a lot of things that are happening today. So to discuss that, we're going to be looking today at green design and sustainable solutions. Now, during this presentation, our three main objectives is first to understand green design. You want to know what is this, what is sustainability, what are ways to measure this, what are ways to track it, and why is it important? And when we think of our own projects, we think of our own businesses, our own courses, anything that we do, a way that we can examine it with this lens of sustainability. Next one we want to talk about is about digital fabrication. So there are a lot of new technologies coming up, 3D printers, I'm sure many of you have heard about, but there are many, many more. And we want to take some time to discuss how this impacts sustainability and how these new innovations, these new technologies are ushering a more sustainable and a more conscious and safer way of manufacturing. And then finally, we're going to look at some examples of green design. So we want to look at some existing projects, some done even by students, products around the world, and some products here locally in the Philippines that are examples of green design and sustainable design put into action. So in particular, we'll be looking at first the SDGs, or 17 Sustainable Development Goals, as a way to frame our discussion on sustainability. Next, we're going to look at some of the brands that use these practices, and then some of the challenges. And then as we go on, we'll also look at case studies of these applications, and then finally how digital fabrication fits in. So to start off, and of course, in order to understand what sustainability as a whole and to look at green design, we have to first define what is green design. Green design is, or sustainable design, is a form of thinking wherein we manufacture, we make, we do, we live our lives designed, intentionally made in a way that's sustainable. And when we say design, this is an active word. It means that we are actively looking to design our lifestyle, design our products, design our experiences as humans that is sustainable. Okay? So design is not just a passive word, it's not just a noun, it's also a verb. It's something that we're doing and we're actively doing. Now, the best way to get on the same page about sustainability is through the 17 SDGs. So these are Sustainable Development Goals, which are established internationally as a way to measure and target sustainability for humanity, as in all over the world. And these goals don't apply to first world nations or developing nations. These apply to everyone around the world, no matter who they are, what country they live in, or what religion they believe in. These goals are supposed to apply to every single human being here on Earth. And as you might imagine, 17 is quite a lot. So we will quickly go over what these 17 are. But in order to make it easier to understand, we're going to separate them into three main categories. So from the beginning, first is no poverty. Next is zero hunger. Third is good health and well-being. Quality education. Gender equality. 6 is clean water and sanitation. Affordable and clean energy. Decent work and economic growth. 9th is industry, innovation, and infrastructure. 10th is reduced inequalities. 11 is sustainable cities and communities. 12, responsible consumption and production. 13, climate action, of course. 14, life below water. 15, life on land. 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. And finally, 17, partnerships for the goals. So there are quite a lot of goals here in this objective. But as you can see, each of these covers all of the basic needs that has been determined to be what's sustainable for human development. And when we talk about sustainability, the idea here is that something that can continue, something that can be sustained. It means that when you look at sustainability, it's not simply looking at being able to do it now with the resources on hand, but it's looking forward into the future and making sure that from 10 years, 50 years, 100 years, 500 years from now, we will be able to continue this kind of action, this course that we are doing. And the second part, which is sustainable development, is the part about development. And this means many things, but primarily innovation and growth. Because it's not enough for us to just continue living the same kind of lifestyle. Part of the goal of humanity is to make life better, to develop, to innovate. And so when we develop, we make life better. So you see here, it's both being able to continue the lifestyle and be sustainable, and also make that lifestyle better. And when we say sustainable, and a lot of these goals, they apply to everyone. So sustainability means also that no matter where you are or who you are able to benefit from these goals. You can also have a life that is developing. Because if a single person in another country is not given these goals and does not meet their needs, then how is it sustainable if it comes at the cost of one or more or anyone's development? Now, 17 goals is quite a lot. So in order to better frame it, we can separate it into three main subjects: the environmental, social, and economic parts. And when all three of these aspects of sustainable development are met, that's what you can call true sustainable development. And it's important to frame it amongst these three because these three must be equally met. To not meet one of these creates an imbalance in the sustainability of the goal. So, for example, the most obvious is environmental. If you cannot sustain the environment, it means that the natural resources that you're drawing from won't be present in the future, which means that you won't be able to make or do what you've been doing 10 years from now, 20 years from now. Economic, because we need to have, people have to have the ability to develop and grow themselves. So economic in being able to make people enjoy fruits of their labor and also to have the benefits of a lifestyle. So if you can, without an economic aspect to it, we cannot sustain that growth because there is no profit to it. There's no motivation to continue that growth. Finally, it's social. This one may seem more abstract and it doesn't usually come up when we think of sustainability. But the idea is that in order to have a society that continues to grow, we have to nurture that kind of mentality that this is a community that seeks to grow. And if you create a society that pulls itself down or that favors a certain demographic for another, then you cannot sustain that because eventually that disparity will continue to increase and your development comes at the cost. So again, social means you have to be able to address all people with those needs, no matter who they are. Now, those three aspects, we've seen them and they're different parts of sustainable development. But now let's chop up that 17 and group them into these parts. So first is economy. So this one may be the most obvious, especially when it comes to businesses, when it comes to products, when it comes to services, because the only way to truly develop is by having a profitable economy, being able to pay for labor, being able to pay for growth, for infrastructure, being able to properly pay labor. So all of these parts must be addressed because sustainability itself does have a cost. This may be a cost in terms of the work we do, the skill, the labor we do, but this is a cost that has to be paid for. And that's part of why it's important. Next one is society. So again, because this is development for humans, the social reason must be closely intertwined. So if, again, there is a certain group or demographic that is favored in the path of developing something, then you cannot continue to develop that without that disparity growing and growing to a point that it cannot continue. So making sure that there is equal opportunity, making sure that there is no discrimination, and that there's opportunity for everyone, no matter who they are, to develop themselves is essential. And this may be hard to connect, for example, if you're thinking of a product or a service, but we can look later in the examples on how they tackle these topics. Finally, environment. And this one should be very easy for most of us who are aware of these environmental issues, because naturally, for us to continue to develop, we have to draw on natural resources, some of which are renewable, some of which aren't. But if we have a system that consumes more than it gives back, then it's only natural to say that there will come a point where there is no longer any resources to draw from. And this is kind of the most obvious and clear example of where sustainable development comes in, because it's very easy to visualize and imagine that if we use up our resources now, the next generation that is born and needs resources for their needs, they will have nothing to draw from. And that is a very clear and stark example of where unsustainable development comes in. Okay. Now, all three of these have to be put into balance, because if you skip any single aspect of this triangle, these aspects of sustainable development, you won't be able to truly call it sustainable. So let's look at an example brand that's actually using sustainability as part of their objective. And we can see how they're addressing these three parts, which is the economic aspect, the social aspect, and the environmental aspect. So the first one I want to mention is for Nestle. So Nestle, it's a very controversial brand. For those who are aware and who look into these big corporations, as time has gone by and as more and more data and information is being shared, there has been more and more questions into the practice of these big businesses. And part of what they're trying to change, these businesses, is by projecting and maintaining this kind of message that for them, they maintain a sustainable development as part of their goal. So, for example, Unilever, another brand, is looking towards these objectives that you can actually see on their businesses. They are making choices based on sustainability in terms of where they source their products, in terms of the processes they use to manufacture, and even the social aspects of the nations where they get from, the labor that they take advantage of, and the costs for the labor that they use. All of these are becoming more and more important because it's becoming a very important aspect on how sustainable is our practices. Now, this is an example in a single page of kind of how Unilever has chosen to present themselves. And if you see here, their goal here is to cover all three parts. They look at their business first in terms of growth, in terms of economic viability. They look also at their customers and the people that work in their brand in terms of their social aspect. And by looking at what resource they draw from, they're able to see and they examine and they present what kind of environmental impact they have. Now, there's a lot of information to glean from what they've presented. And for many, this kind of marketing that they're presenting, that they have sustainability, that these key words like safety, well-being, responsibility, that these words have the power of saying that their movement is sustainable. But it's important to also consider that these are just what they have presented, and that the real data behind it may not always line up. Okay? But it's a way of seeing a brand that is trying to take these three aspects, the economic aspect, social aspect, and the environmental aspect of sustainability, and is trying to address them as part of their company structure, as part of their company's vision, as part of how their brand operates. Now, when we look at these three, we can look at individual parts about it. We can look at individual ways that this is addressed. And again, sustainability is a very multifaceted issue because you're dealing with so many factors. And summing it up is just these three Ps. Being able to balance all three is harder or as hard as it sounds. And even big companies, for example, like Unilever, like the one I showed before, there is still some level of disconnect and still some level of development in actually reaching that goal of sustainability. But the benefit is, because people are being more conscious of it, there is now a growing demand. There is a growing need for it. And one of the easiest ways to see this is, well, one is through the stock. Awareness about sustainability and putting an importance on being able to monitor how sustainable the development of products, the development of businesses is drawing more and more people to demand that kind of responsibility. The companies I mentioned, Nestle and Unilever, are actually the subject of a lot of controversy, specifically about sustainability in terms of how their products operate, in terms of how they their social responsibility, because in the past there were questionable acts that they have done, questionable practices. And while it may seem that now they are addressing it, the question still stands. And the only real way to tell if they have answered that question and if they are following sustainability is through data, through learning the effects of their actions. Okay. All right. Now, I think we have a question from Raharjo. Sorry if I'm pronouncing the name wrong. Permission to discuss how, if we break down the definition of sustainable to at least exist and successor. Okay, let's then take some time now to break down, I guess, sustainable. It would be in two phases. First is the current situation. To sustain means to exist, as in to have a product, to have a business, to be able to establish something. But when you say sustainability, it's looking not just at the present, but at the future. And it means that whoever is going to benefit or whoever is going to live in the situation that's in the future has to be able to have their own level of development. For products, this may seem obvious in the sense that your current product will be inherited by someone down the line and they will be able to continue to sell or develop that product. But it doesn't apply, and it's not limited to just products. It also applies to environments. For example, in housing markets, is it a sustainable practice to continue to develop this land when the land is becoming more limited? Or will the act of you developing this land impact negatively future generations? Will this land now become unusable for agriculture? Will it become unusable for forestry? These are the kinds of ideas that sustainability applies not just to businesses and practices, but also to concepts such as land, such as resources. Even culture is a form of sustainability, because again, we mentioned the social aspect. There are many different ways we can interpret sustainability. And in this specific one, we're looking in terms of design. So we'll frequently touch back and ground ourselves in the form of products or services. But again, sustainability is a practice that you can apply to a lot of different fields. And even the practice of design, which is the intentional purpose of things, can also be applied, which we'll discuss later in the second half when we discuss green design. Right? Now, there's a growing demand for these kinds of practices. There's a growing demand for transparency from businesses. There's a growing demand for responsibility of big corporations for sustainable actions. There is movements on the social level for people calling for change. There is also movements on government levels and legislative bodies who are creating laws, regulations that promote sustainability. There are many different ways of us seeing how sustainability is being called into the light. And I think technically it's an old topic. Many years ago, it's already been discussed. So we're quite well aware. But one of the interesting ways that have kind of reinforced how important it is that different bodies, for example, even investors, these are organizations that have actually gotten together, investor networks that focus on sustainability as part of their mandate. And their goal is that these investors collaborate together to invest into businesses, invest into practices and corporate strategies that promote sustainability. It means to say that there is a more serious backing towards the importance of sustainability. And whatever the motivation may be, nonetheless, it's important to see that businesses or investors or these structures in our society are supporting this movement. There are actually more than just these mentioned. Climate Action 100, Investor Agenda, even the Paris Aligned Investment Initiative are all examples of investor networks that are looking to support businesses, looking to support services and practices that do this. Now, when we talk about all these sustainability and the goals for this, it's important to always ask ourselves and question our own progress. So my suggestion is, as we go through this, as we look at each of these questions, for example, the next will be for the metrics, I want to try for you to look at your course, look at your business, look at what you intend to do in the future, and try to look at it through this lens of sustainability to ask these questions. And this is in preparation because when you get to part 2 and we look at how we design for sustainability, you can actually apply some of these design principles to whatever it is you do. Okay? So remember, every time we look at these topics, we want to try an introspective look at what we do. And this can be from as big as our business or our industry, all the way to our hobbies, our practices, things that we do. Is there ways that we can be more sustainable? Okay. Okay. Now, one of the ways and important ways to measure goals is, of course, through metrics, ways that we can monitor and see the progress if we have attained these goals. So in order for metrics to be discussed, there's one important topic that needs to also be presented, which is about transparency. The only way you can measure and create metrics and data about sustainability, data about economic, social, and environmental impact is if we have data on which to draw from. And that's why it's important here to mention transparency. So one of the brands and examples I want to state when we discuss transparency, especially in the lens of a corporate brand, is actually through Timberland. So this is the footwear brand. And what Timberland has actually done is they've actively taken a stance on reporting the transparency of their business. And so you can actually look up Timberland and they will actually present yearly and quarterly reporting about their products in terms of the impact of where they source their leather, in terms of the impact on their production, on their factory waste and output. And this is an important thing to mention and put first in terms of metrics, because the only way that we've actually been able to understand and realize how important sustainability has been and the reason why environmental impact and climate change is on the forefront is because we have the data to reinforce it. We have the data to support that something is wrong, that there is a problem with the current way we're living. And that data is primarily gained through transparency. There are many businesses now and requirements for them to report their impact. And as these metrics continue to come in, more and more data is coming out that scientists and other research institutions are actually able to better assess the impact. For example, air index, which is a very general way of monitoring the quality of pollutants in the air, is only possible once all countries have actually had and presented the data. For businesses in particular, monitoring output of waste is now becoming a bigger issue. Monitoring, for example, the supply chain, where they source, if there is humane labor involved, whether there is sustainable harvesting practices. All of those are related to transparency. And without transparency and the ability to collect data and metrics, there is no way to monitor the progress or the metrics of sustainability. And again, going back to the concept of sustainability, if you remember, I mentioned there that it's also so that in the future, you're able to sustain development in the future. But the only way we can see into the future without superpowers is if we have data to project and to predict and monitor our output. That's why without this idea of transparency, without the idea of collecting information, without tracking what is happening today, there's no way to call it sustainable because we don't know what will happen tomorrow. We don't know what will happen in a couple of years. And so it's very important as a precursor to metrics is to discuss that transparency is very key and essential when you're talking about sustainability in a system. Now, let's be specific. Sustainability, in terms of metrics, can be monitored many ways. There are many general ways through research, through scientific data, through records and observations. But some of the more distinct ways that people have implemented these metrics, first is from certifying bodies. So there are a large number of certifying bodies that have come up, both internationally and even locally, and these have been in existence for many years. But the role of these certifying bodies is that they serve as a way of measuring and a standard on which to look at sustainability. And these certifying bodies have their own scope and limitation in terms of what kind of environment they deal with, whether they deal with the more social or environmental aspect. But the important part to consider is that certifying bodies are a way for us to maintain metrics on sustainability, because their objective and their role is specifically for them to examine the practices and sustainability of anything, whether it is a business, a service, or a practice. Even here in the Philippines, we have departments like the DENR that actually whose role is to monitor this. And the success or how successful these services can be determined on the way they're evaluated by these institutions. And these aren't limited to also government bodies. There are educational institutions that have projects, that have organizations that do similar roles. So one key part about metrics is certifying bodies. And when we move now to products, particularly in services, this is something that we see a lot, especially, and it's been growing nowadays. And I think at this point has been kind of taken for granted, is another concept called eco-labels. So the idea of eco-labels is they follow similarly to the role of certifying bodies, but they focus more on being able to present a brand or a mark of satisfying sustainability. And as you can see here, over the years, they have grown. There are many labels that can be made. When we look at our products, it is important to also see the value of these eco-labels as a way of finding out sustainability, because they help in us deciding as consumers how well a product is adhering to sustainability. And at the same time, in terms of someone who is looking to design or create a product, there are ways for us to shape our decision making. They can shape the way we source, the way we manufacture, the way we produce based on these requirements. So eco-labels are a very useful way at times to monitor the success of sustainability. Now, we've discussed some of the principles behind it. We've also discussed some of the metrics on how to measure it. And of course, very naturally, there are challenges. And we'll discuss more when we go into the applications later on. But in terms of challenges, first and foremost, and for those who have existing businesses or have interacted, sustainability is not always the profitable option. There is a lot of research. There is a lot of time, both in terms of product, in terms of service, in terms of branding, in terms of marketing, that goes into being sustainable. And all of these incur cost. But the important thing to consider when we're discussing this cost in terms of investment is, just like how sustainability functions, is to look into the future. When we look at sustainability, the goal is to be able to continue to develop your business, your brand, your product. And this, when we think of the challenges in terms of applying for certification, applying for different processes, it's important to also weigh and understand that this process of becoming more sustainable will come at a cost. The next one, and this is actually kind of important, especially in light of what we recently discussed with eco-labeling, is something called greenwashing. Greenwashing is a practice in which a business can market or present themselves as adhering to sustainability, as using a green and eco-friendly mindset. But in reality, the brand or product is simply taking advantage of this marketing, this form of messaging, to present and confuse or intentionally mislead consumers that there is some kind of sustainability going on. And greenwashing is important to monitor because as much as we want to push this mindfulness about sustainability, if a brand does not make the proper changes, does not make the right investments and changes to their system, to their products, and only makes nominal or face value adjustments in order to appease this consciousness for sustainable design, then it is actually damaging to their goal and is called greenwashing. So one of the most obvious examples of greenwashing that has come out over time is actually something we previously discussed, which is eco-labels. There's a question right here, actually. What certifications, if any, are best to representative business practices? And the difficulty is that for that question, it's no longer clear. The number of eco-labels, the number of certification bodies and processes that have gone into ensuring sustainability has actually developed into a point where there are actually so many different kinds of eco-labels, different kinds of certification and regulation, that it's beginning to obfuscate the actual purpose. And so each label corresponds to a specific kind of business. They have eco-labels, they have regulations and certification for food, for services, for commercial products. They even have certification for mining, natural resources, logging. They have certification for services. All of these are different forms of monitoring that can actually be used against the role of adapting sustainable practices. And it's listed here because it is a challenge in determining which ones are relevant and which ones are viable for a specific business. They are too specific for each business. And by the end of this, we'll discuss one specific one about packaging and one example of a form of eco-label that functions. But the truth of the matter is that the way that the attention has put on being sustainable and following these green trends has also created a negative reaction for many businesses and brands that are capitalizing on this movement and are not actually making the correct changes and to their practices and operations. Okay. Next is market demand. So this one's a bit tricky. We know that sustainable design and green marketing, green products has been, technically it's past its heyday. Maybe 10 years ago, there was a large influx of demand and attention on green products, and it's kind of died down. And the difficulty here is that there is this realization, and this relates to the economic aspect, that the cost of having sustainable packaging, the cost of sustainable products and services may sometimes be too high for a market. A good example is when we think of organically grown fruits, right? The natural idea and conception most people have is that they are healthier, but they are usually more expensive, or they are smaller for their cost. And that mass-produced or commercial or industrial products like, let's say, processed meats, processed vegetables, they are much cheaper. And so the difficulty here is that market demand, it's not as simple as addressing it that, okay, sustainability is the goal and we have to do this no matter what. Because the reality is that if we can't address that economic aspect where there is no growth or profit, if no one can afford these green designs, these green products, then how would you be able to sustain that kind of development? How would you be able to sustain that product, that service? And so it's important to look at the market demand in the sense that you have to understand where can we fit sustainability into our process, where the market can accommodate. And this is a very complex issue, and it's nothing new for many businesses because it is a challenge for everyone. But the goal here is really to balance and accept that the market will accept certain adjustments, but it has to be structured in a way that they can accommodate increase in cost, increase in labor, or as we discuss in the future, it will have to force businesses to look more creatively in how to promote or take advantage of sustainability while maintaining the same price, the same accessibility for their products. And there are businesses that have actually found ways to add sustainability to their brand, to their product, to their manufacturing system without endangering or without making their product more expensive, without making it more limited. And they're actually very good examples of how sustainability can be put into practice. We'll be mentioning those later as we look into the case studies. And then finally, and not limited just to these, is also technical expertise. A big part about sustainability is a understanding of the processes. It's an understanding of the materials, the science that goes behind it. Because again, sustainability is a data-driven subject. It has to be monitored and quantified to be able to solidly say that we are able to sustain this in the future. And this means that these are usually highly technical fields. For example, something you may take for granted is for food packaging. How many of you think about what kind of ink they print cardboard boxes with? How many of you wonder when you, let's say, buy your online shopping service and they give you that plastic bag with a design on it? Do many people think about how did they print this? How much resources were spent in order to put this oranger label or this pattern on my plastic bag? And then think about, I cut it open and I throw it away. And all of that effort is discarded. So one of the examples of where technical expertise comes in is, for example, in food packaging, in the inks that we use. There is a growing demand for products. And I think in the face of this decentralized economy, where being able to deliver products is important, packaging has taken a bigger role. Packaging in the form of transport, in terms of bags, in terms of how we present it. And as some businesses are starting to look into the effects, inks and packaging for both clothing, for products, actually is among the larger contributors of pollutants in wastewater. In particular, I believe clothing, especially for dyeing fabric, a large amount of pollutants comes out from the process. And it's not as simple as saying, okay, I want a sustainable product, so I will choose recycled fabric. I'll choose recycled materials. There becomes a question of the inks that you use, are those safe as they leach into the water? Are they sustainable in that your product will be fit to wear? When you put packaging on the box that you have, do you think twice about whether you're going to use a tarpaulin, which uses solvent-based inks, or am I going to invest in a different kind of paper? Election season's coming up. And for many, especially if you've ever lived near a printing shop, the amount of tarpaulins that are manufactured is crazy. The amount of ink that is spent and discarded during this process is similarly crazy. And all these processes, this process of creating these products, even the ink that they use has a very profound effect. And it's not something that you can simply replace with something that's more sustainable, something that's more green, that's more recycled. There becomes a large amount of technical expertise that goes into it. So the idea is that for many businesses that want to adopt sustainability, there is a necessary cost in terms of technical expertise. If your product wants to be the most efficient and the most optimized and the most sustainable way of manufacturing, of sourcing the materials, it requires a similar level of dedication to researching about the product, researching on what materials you use, the alternatives, the life cycle. Do we look at, when we buy our packaging, do we look at how long it will take to degrade, its lifespan in a landfill? Do we look at the local situation? Is it a landfill, for example, like in the Philippines, or is there access to better recycling stations? When we look at the way we segregate our waste, we may segregate our waste now, but when it reaches the waste disposal, do they just lump it all together because there's no facilities to accommodate waste segregation? All of these flow into technical expertise. And in a way, it also is a form of investment cost in that there's a large amount of thinking and research and planning that has to go into our products beyond just what we think we're dealing with. If we're dealing with a food service, have we looked into where we can dispose of the spoon and forks? Have we looked into where we can dispose of food? Is there more safer alternatives than simply discarding it and leaving it to the trash system? There are the ways that we can apply sustainability is more intricate and complicated than it first seems for many products. And if we take the time to research everything about the product, the way it's manufactured, the way it's sourced, the way it's disposed of, if you look at the product's life cycle and kind of break it down and thoroughly look at how you can improve it, then you can find ways to access or to take advantage of more sustainable practices. A lot. Okay. So we've seen these challenges, and admittedly, they're quite a lot. But let's tackle some in particular, and specifically the technical expertise section. I just mentioned that there are many ways you can apply sustainability to the practice, not just in the service, but even like through the entire life cycle. So what we can do is actually look at sustainable design and see how it fits in terms of how it affects the design process. So the design process can be very complicated, and not everyone here might be a designer. Not everyone here has worked in a design field where they make a product or a service. But the idea of designing is more of a way of thinking, okay? Design thinking, as it's sometimes called, is a mindset in which we put intention into our products and in the way that they are developed. As I said from the start, when we design, it is a intent or a purpose for the product or service. And when you look at products in this form, that they have a function, that they have a purpose to serve, you can kind of see where we can add sustainability in the process. Okay. And so this means that we are going to design a product with sustainability in mind. And this designing process has many stages, which we will be going over. Okay. Now, okay. So looking at sustainability, let's first break down the design process. And this is just a rough idea of how a product is designed. So first, a product can exist as a concept. This could be something like you were brainstorming with your friends and you said, maybe I want to start selling my own guitars that I designed myself. The idea here is that when the idea is a concept, it's in its most abstract and malleable form. And when we look at sustainability as an objective, as a goal that has to be met, we can already start injecting sustainability in that concept. So let's take that idea that, let's say you wanted to make your own guitars. You wanted to design your own electric guitars, for example. You can look into, how can I make my product first more sustainable? You can think, we're using natural materials, wood. And naturally, it's easy to say, okay, let's use recycled wood. Let's see where we can, how we can use that and make it look like good products. But the goal here and the difference is that you can examine each part of your product, not just the product itself. You can look into, okay, when I manufacture my product, how am I going to source the labor? Will I outsource it for a factory abroad that does very cheap labor? Or can I look into local crafts that may have the skills needed for this kind of business? When we think of location, we think maybe we can include sustainability by going to a place with an existing cultural importance for handicrafts, for wood. We can look at where can we implement sustainability in terms of disposal. Maybe I want these guitars to have recycled materials that are easy to be disposed of, or that are easy to degrade, or they are products that can easily be replaced in case they get damaged. Different ways of seeing your product from a conceptual standpoint. Let's go shift to another one. For example, you're designing food packaging. You want to sell food as part of a business, and you can now start to look at as a concept. The kind of food that you sell, would it be something that you can source locally? Are there farmers who have an excess of produce who you can take advantage of that lack of need? Can you add value to those products, to those materials? You can also look at it in terms of a social standpoint. Are there very rich cultural icons, foods that I can use and promote as part of a more sustainable social movement to preserve these social practices? Economic. You can also try looking at different demographics. Maybe I can find a way to make a product that is very, very cheap and easy to produce and to sell, but maybe I can inject some level of value in the way it's presented, in the way that it's marketed, to elevate the way these products are seen. Instead of just being cheap, maybe I can make a high quality but cheap product that looks professional, but still can be accessible to most. Conceptually, we can break it down and put in more thought into how sustainable the process is. And again, this concept doesn't necessarily have to be a product or service. Even projects, for example, I assume some who are attending here are students. When we look at our thesis, it may not have been an immediate part of our project, or our goal is that it's sustainable. Maybe it wasn't really relevant, but it's an important way of seeing how we can shape the way we think of ideas in a way that when I look at this product, is it something that I can sustain and continue in the future? Meaning, if I were to bring this to market, would my guitars still be sellable in 100 years? Would the wood that I source, would the labor or the crafts or the skilled labor that I use, do they have a pool of talent? Do they have other work which they can use? Is there a market for my product? If it's food, is it something that I know will sell? Is it something that has some cultural value? There's a lot of things you can consider, even just on the base concept of your product when you think of sustainability. And the good part here is that when your product is only a concept, costs almost nothing to change your mind. And so it's important to kind of put as much thought and keeping in mind sustainability, even from the core aspect. And the next one, which would be prototyping. So prototyping is kind of like your first version, your version 1.0 of your product. And the objective here is just that you can kind of see how the product fits. Prototyping may not always have ways to be cheaper, but for many products, like let's say cell phones, commercial products, home appliances, the process of prototyping is making something and then making changes and then adjustments and making it again. Now, in the prototyping process, this is actually pretty fun because this is where your idea comes to life. And sustainability in terms of prototyping doesn't really happen because it's more of a transitive stage, but you can also consider, are there ways that I can prototype my production process, meaning ways I can test new ways of making things that makes it more economically viable, that produces less waste. Even the process of making things, making your product, is a form of prototyping. And so it's important to see if you can inject sustainability there. Production is almost, it's very obvious when you think of manufacturing, when you think of products and design. When we discuss digital fabrication technologies, this is where production really gets changed. I think I mentioned to you before that there's new inventions, right, that have changed the way we manufacture products. There are ways that can address, for example, I only make 100 pieces of my furniture a year. Not enough to warrant a factory, but it's still quite a lot. Or you may have products that are very unique. For example, you sell seasonal fruits and vegetables, and your packaging always changes depending on, maybe in 3 months, you have to change the packaging. Maybe you're looking with branding, right? That uses printed branding that you need only 100 pieces and they'll change. For example, maybe for weddings, maybe for giveaways. There are different digital processes that have advantages over mass production. Where in mass production, it's cheaper in volume, meaning producing in bulk. In the Philippines, we have the situation where we're able to manufacture, but it's not quite at the same level of other nations, which have heavier industries. So our labor is usually more expensive. And frequently, many products here in the Philippines are more unique. They're more small to medium scale. And one of the things that have actually changed is that there are new production processes, not just 3D printing, which is technically old, that have actually been able to cater to different niches, short run productions, unique prototypes, very, very customizable designs, personalization. All of those are new developments in technology that we can take advantage of. So here, when you think of our products, we shouldn't box ourselves into old traditional production processes. We shouldn't box ourselves into mass production, to having to import products mass produced in a factory in China. We can think of new and innovative ways to make it using the new fabrication technologies that we have access to. Okay, marketing, branding of your product, and seeing where you can position your product to be different, to take advantage of. It's not as direct and it's not maybe as clear. It's not as obvious. I mean, maybe when you're thinking of waste in terms of marketing, but there are still ways to think of sustainability in terms of, is this message something that is socially responsible? Is the messaging of my product acceptable for everyone, not just for a specific demographic? Am I offending others, as a form of insensitivity? All right. Okay. Good question. I think Rafa, we can look into that. We can save that one for the end of the presentation. So kind of ideas that we can try seeing where sustainability kicks in. Okay. All right. So distribution, another form. This is kind of most obvious in this delivery economy. It's come up and without a lot of adaptation, but there are movements now that are trying to find ways to make this process simpler, to make it more sustainable, whether it's in terms of the waste we use, whether it's in terms of regulation for the packaging that's used. Maybe it's even just the system or the way we centralize or manage the delivery system. Distribution is just as important for your product in terms of how it's made. For example, can you make it that your product is shipped in a smaller box that takes up less space and uses less material? Can you make a product that you can assemble so it's easier? Good example here is flat pack furniture. Instead of having furniture that is large and difficult to transport, the IKEA, who kind of like revolutionized this idea, created these furniture that you can flat pack and downsize the packaging, which meant that it was easier to store, it was easier to distribute, and it became more accessible for people. And it made the product itself more sustainable in terms of taking a product and changing and revolutionizing the way it is distributed, meaning assembled in this case, and it transformed the way people perceive the products. It didn't anymore have to be very expensive. They didn't have to be large and difficult to ship. You can simply buy a chair and assemble it in your home. And it was an interesting way of revolutionizing that product. And while it may not seem immediately sustainable, like how we traditionally see it, but it has transformed the product in something that, okay, in 100 years from now, as transport and logistics becomes more difficult, as more and more people are demanding products, this ability to downsize my product and make it something you can assemble is proving to be very useful and very valuable. So things and revolutions that function like that. And the last one, which usually is very key, is for disposal. So this is usually the one many people focus on for products because trash and wastage and pollutants are usually the key part. But when we design a product, part of that design process is intentionally looking at how a product is disposed of. Products have to be made, and to show you examples of how this was made, there are, if you've ever seen those utensils that are actually made out of paper, uncoated paper. So they're examples of products that are kind of trying to change the way they're perceived. Disposal works in multiple ways. And the first example is easier to dispose. Those paper straws, not perfect because they are treated, but there are products that are shifting towards more disposable packaging. For example, food containers, rather than using styrofoam or plastic, they're opting to use paper or lined paper, which is easier to dispose of. So this makes your products easier in terms of how it's disposed of and how it decays. The other alternative is making products that are not meant to be disposed of. these are products that are meant to be reused. For example, there are shampoo brands who I think had these campaigns where they would offer refills for bottles. And the idea was that rather than marketing a product that was marked for disposal, consumption then disposal, they created a branding that tried to attempt to transform their products to be reused, to be kept and refilled, and to continue serving a purpose. And these two are similarly at kind of extremes. You have one extreme where it's easier to dispose of and one that it's harder to dispose of because it's reusable. But these ideas are just examples, and there's many things in between. When we look at the examples after the break, we'll be able to see what are some examples of easy to dispose and what are some examples of reusable, and some examples of brands that have gone in between in having products that even transform from one product to another during their life cycle. But the main point here is that part of the design process of your product is also looking at its end of life, at its disposal process. Okay. Now, the final one, the next topic will be on sustainable design and some applications and methods to reach it. But before we continue, I think we've gone through a lot of information. We've discussed the principles and how to see the aspects of sustainable design. We've looked at what are some of the metrics or ways that we can measure design. We've seen the importance of transparency and some examples of corporate branding that uses sustainability. We've seen challenges, the difficulties of it. We've taken a look into the design process, how we can inject sustainability and keep it as part of the objective as we design a product. So it's quite a lot. And what I think we can do is, if it's all right, we can take a quick 5-minute break to digest and mull over these learnings. And then we can reconvene after 5 minutes and we'll continue the next part. So the next section will be talking primarily about more examples of how specifically sustainable design kicks in and some applications that we can use and case studies. All right. Then after that, we'll have a Q&A portion. So I do appreciate all of the comments and the questions that are coming in right now. And I will scroll up at the end in the Q&A to try to address as many of the questions as we can.
All right. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Thank you, Sir Gideon. I know some of you got information overload. So I think that was a well-deserved break. If you have any questions, you can go right ahead and send it in our chat box, and we'll address them later on during our open forum. For a quick recap before we delve back, number one, we learned that sustainability has 17 sustainable development goals. It's an international standard that humanity as a whole should aspire to attain for all. 2, the importance of establishing what is sustainable. This will prevent weak, misguided efforts, determine metrics and goals, and quantifies the effort. 3rd, structuring sustainability, a framework to evaluate a brand or organization. It redefines and refines a nebulous sentiment. 4th, metrics for sustainability and the importance of transparency. And 5th, sustainability has challenges, the investment costs, greenwashing, market demands, and technical expertise. All right, I think I let you guys breathe long enough. Again, don't be shy to send some questions to our chat box, and we'll address it later during our Q&A session. Without further ado, please welcome back Sir Gideon.
Okay, thank you for that. And again, I know that it's a lot of information. Sustainability is a very difficult concept at times to get, but the important part to really get here is that it's looking at everything as a whole. We really can't apply sustainability to one specific part of our design because you end up with a lot of different problems. And sustainability is looking at the whole picture, the whole product from beginning to the end, and finding out what we can do about it, what kind of changes we can make. Okay. Now, the last part, which is more looking at applications and examples of sustainable practices, this one I think is a lot easier. And it's a good way for us to digest all the information that we've taken in. Okay, so let me share the screen again. So welcome back. Hope you had a good brain break. Now, as I mentioned before we started, that this one will be focusing more on methods and applications of applying sustainable design. So first is, again, let's recap very slightly how it affects design and some examples that we can do. So Design and sustainability affects first and foremost the end product. This can be whatever it is you're making, what service, what platform you're using, and it's important to consider it on a conceptual level. Sustainability can also come into the packaging. And as someone who practices industrial design, and in this case, because we're looking at green design specifically, packaging is actually a very interesting and often overlooked aspect in terms of sustainability for products. Another is marketing. And this is more similarly related to the earlier topics about regulation and certification, as well as corporate transparency, the way you present and message your brand. Okay. Now, we're going to look at some examples specifically of sustainable design. And these are some we've picked out. Some are international, meaning from other countries. Others are actually here locally made. And the interesting part is not all of the designs that we're going to discuss here are good. If you remember, I mentioned to you one of the problems, which is called greenwashing. There actually is a product here in this list that is an example of greenwashing. Okay. But the objective here is that we want to examine these outputs in design and see how they work, see how they've tried to implement sustainability. Okay, so the first one we want to look at is Kalhom. It's a the student project. I believe this one is from Thailand, so I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it properly. But the idea here is that it's a form of packaging for rice. And the focus here is that the packaging that they've designed for their product is actually different and is a sustainable alternative. So what they've done is the rice can be bought in this bamboo basket. And this basket is actually doubles as a serving container that you can actually cook. So how it works is you cook the rice in your rice cooker, but you actually cook it inside the bamboo basket. And the reason it works this way is it's actually a practice that they have in Thailand. And so what they were able to do was turn this idea, this cultural practice, and actually turn it into a packaging for the product. And this served as its primary packaging. And what does it do? It changed the packaging from something you simply discard and throw away to something that actually serves as part of the product's life cycle. Meaning, as the product is being used or rice in particular is being cooked, it actually doubles as the container. And it gives more value to the role of the packaging. It adds a depth of complexity into it as a product. And from what you can see, the way they present, the color of the bamboo, the natural feel of the material, as well as the minimal use of graphics, it all creates this, alludes to a product that is more focused on the packaging itself. And it's an interesting way of seeing how we can transform existing elements and then changing their role or adding more functions to it. Okay, so pretty cool. This one is the Shiawassee Banana. So it's actually a banana packaging. It's a single, it's for only a few, not like a whole bunch. And the idea that it's a paper carrier bag. And they actually changed the graphic to look similar to a banana leaf. So it adds this natural look to the banana and it increases that association with natural materials. These ones next are actually some of my favorite. First is cocoa form. So in cocoa form, if you're familiar with packaging, it's a coconut fiber that has been given a natural binder and is heat pressed into different shapes. So this one's actually very, very cool because this is an example of adding value to a untapped natural resource or adding value to already an existing natural resource. So they took cocoa fibers, which is actually a very big industry here in the Philippines, and they were able to revolutionize the process in how they work it. By combining it with that binder and using heat pressing, which is used traditionally for other materials like plastics, they were actually able to create a new function for the material. It can serve as these secondary or primary packaging. It can serve as trays, boxes, or containers. And their goal is that first, they've taken this resource, which is cocoa fiber, and added value. So this in turn actually has an effect that goes more than just the product. This means that farmers who farm cocoa fibers now have increased value for their product. So they've addressed a economic and a social advantage to sustainability. They're tapping a resource that isn't immediately associated with food packaging. So this is also good economically because it means that you're not going through a bottleneck in terms of material. Next is in terms of sustainability. It's because it uses natural binder and coconut fiber. These packaging can actually decay and degrade very, very easily. They can be burned, they can be shredded with little chemical byproduct. And this is very cool because, imagine the idea that you can throw away your packaging into the dirt. And within a day or even less than a day, the natural binder will come off and it will actually become just as any other cocoa fiber or plant matter on the ground. It's a very good example of reimagining existing materials, adding value, transforming its purpose using modern manufacturing methods like a heat press. And to discuss like some of the challenges with this, one of the obvious ones is, of course, lifespan. This kind of product isn't going to last forever. It will damage easily and will be very susceptible, for example, to water and other factors. But because they've chosen to position it in a particular niche, which is for secondary packaging or for trays and boxes for food or for just packaging, like safety packaging, they found a niche where the material is actually able to perform within its limitations and exceeds in terms of compared to other materials like plastics or foam. So obviously I sound very biased because this is probably one of my favorite examples here. Next example, for example, is the edible cutlery. So this was a process where they mold their own ice cream spoons using rice, wheat, and sorghum. So the idea here is they've created a new product. Normally, we don't associate spoon and forks as part of our product. They're just a natural need for any food. But what they did was, in addition to their product, which is their ice cream, they've created this kind of novel idea of having the spoon that you can eat. And it adds value, it adds marketing value to your product, as well as differentiating itself from other competitors, meaning it's interesting, it's fun. It's something that you would say that other than the ice cream, it would be fun to just try eating your spoon. And this kind of whimsical nature, this idea that you can revolutionize very simple and basic and often taken for granted elements like cutlery, is a good way of showing how you can innovate and revolutionize existing products and processes. Okay. There is something similar later on that I'll be presenting. But this one is like the first step. So this one, it's not as fully fledged as the other products, and it's a very simple practice. So in the supermarkets, rather than using plastic and cling wrap to wrap vegetables for presentation, they've taken to the practice of using banana leaves. It only serves as a secondary packaging when it's on display in the shelves, but it adds a nice amount of marketing and messaging with the green of the products. Again, it's adding more value to an existing resource and finding ways that they can use it. So it's an interesting, low cost and low tech way of applying sustainability. And it's often taken for granted, but when you see them in practice and these ideas, it kind of makes it more interesting. And it's kind of clear that, oh, yeah, that's a lot more sustainable than having to buy rolls of plastic every year. Just some cool examples. I mentioned before that one of these products is actually an example of greenwashing. And just to jump to where it is, the one I wanted to mention was actually the Nando Shiawassee Banana. So it's a product that's a good example of greenwashing in the sense that if you examine what the product is, it's a printed bag, a paper bag. And what they did was they changed the graphic and the shape to look similar to a banana leaf. But this is an example of greenwashing in the sense that the product itself is still using processed paper. In fact, it's using ink paper, which is harder to manufacture than plain paper. It appears to draw upon green motifs like plant and natural matter, but the actual concept behind it, the actual manufacturing process, and the function of the packaging remains the same, meaning there is no actual improvement to how this product is addressing sustainability. So compared to the other products, it's an example of taking sustainability and viewing it from a single scope. It's taking sustainability and saying, okay, I want to enter this market of sustainability, and the best way is let's put a green leaf on our product. It's a good idea, and they do it. But because they looked at sustainability in a vacuum and they didn't address sustainability as an entire process, and they didn't take into account the different social factors, economic or environmental factors of this plan to be more sustainable, you end up with a product that only appeases or appeals to that green trend, but doesn't contribute to it. So if there's ever like a beware kind of example, I would set this as one of them, as a product that attempts to be sustainable, but falls flat and actually damages by deceiving people who think that this is a sustainable product. All right. Now, next example is these three, one of which is actually very famous if you're familiar with the James Dyson Awards. So the first one is a sugar cloud lamp. And this is more of a display piece, more of a designer concept. And the idea is it's actually white cotton that's been crocheted, but it's actually been stiffened together using water and sugar. And the reason I like this example is because it kind of takes the idea of designer items that are very high concept, but combines it with a very simple and a very elegant way of manufacturing the process. And it changes the idea that you can have high concept, high value products that don't have to always appeal to that natural looking material. But by changing very simple parts or by experimenting with new ways of manufacturing, for example, using water and sugar, they've actually created this more interesting way of creating things. And as a designer concept, it's less about the product itself and more of the process. It's just a cool example overall that such a like an elegant idea can be executed with a very low cost and an economic way of implementing it. Next one, for those of you who are designers who participate in James Dyson competitions, which I'm sure there are many, you may be familiar with this, the Aureus by Carvey Maige. So this was actually a Filipino invention that won the award. And the idea is that using organic luminescent food waste, they created a panel that is efficient at absorbing solar energy. But instead of using materials like plastics and synthetic materials, using luminescent food waste, they were able to create these kind of panels. And it's a cool way of marrying science and like technological concepts with a very natural way of looking at the materials. And so again, this is meant to sort of break the perception that there are like things that you can't make renewable, like electricity or certain things. That there are actually ways that you can continuously try to break these perceptions and create these innovations that actually work. And it's a very, very cool example because as a designer, solar panels are something you take for granted, that they have to be built this way. They have to be made of glass. They have to use these components, but it shatters it by introducing these elements of sustainability that makes you rethink and question what those manufacturing processes are. And it's very creative. It's really cool. This one. So this is actually kind of similar to the one with the cocoa fibers. So it uses water hyacinth that's dried and woven together to make it into a fabric. And that fabric is used to make this cushion. And the concept here that I like to stress is they take a natural resource, water hyacinth, which is actually an invasive plant species, I believe, that's very, very abundant, and they are finding new value for it. By creating new value and creating products from these materials, they are sort of cultivating a need for it, meaning there is more motivation in the economic sense for it to be harvested. which helps address that invasive species problem. And at the same time, it's recycling a natural material that looks and has a really good motif with Filipino products. It's a product that you could see, for example, in a Filipino lifestyle home, and it fits. But when you think about the material that they're not using expensive imported materials, they're using local materials. It can kind of show you that finding creative ways to use these abundant materials, giving more value for these materials, is a good way of exploring sustainability. It's not as fancy, or it doesn't sound as amazing as, like, let's say, using recycled wood or having these very high-tech things. But simply changing how we source the materials of our products can have a very profound way and effect on the sustainability of a product. Okay, so now I think it's quite clear for all of us just how important green design is. And if it was not, it's easy just to think about all the information we've had in terms of climate change, in terms of pollutants, in terms of natural resources that are increasing in cost, in terms of how there is more and more data that is pointing to the effects of human beings on this earth, meaning we are damaging the way the earth is moving. And when we think of these processes, there are more than just products, more than just these. There are also other methods in order to promote sustainability. They are more structural, they're more infrastructure related, but these are other subjects that you can actually explore when you talk about sustainability. They're not limited to just the products we're dealing with. And one of the cool things that I want to mention is particularly in terms of technology. If you've ever heard the term smart, well, no, you have smartphones, smart gadgets. They've actually applied those similar technologies to manufacturing in the form of smart factories. And in a nutshell, the idea is that these technologies are actually able to monitor these factories' output, meaning they know how much pollutants every stage is creating. And again, data-driven science is important. They use the data from these smart technologies to actually change and regulate these factories. And that's on a grand scale in terms of like large manufacturing things. There is an airplane, please. But one of the things that technology has also developed is through digital fabrication machines. So we won't go so much into detail here, but digital fabrication machines are actually kind of, in my opinion, something perfect for the setting of the Philippines. Digital fabrication is fabrication that uses computers to optimize the process, computers that control it. And there are many different kinds of forms of digital fabrication. But the key part here is that, one, it's digital. You and I know how to use a computer. We've learned a number of skills. Many of you might even know how to do like Photoshop or some kind of illustration software that you may have learned on your own. It might be a hobby. It might be something that wasn't related to your course, but you were able to learn it. And that idea of the ease of access and how anyone can access these technologies is part of what makes digital important. Because one, it's sustainable that anyone can learn these machines because it's digitally controlled. The second is that these fabrication machines are actually meant for low to medium, actually small to low to medium production, meaning they're meant for short runs of 100 to 200 pieces, which is actually in line with much of the Philippines economy because we do not have heavy industries and we focus more on products. But the reason that it fits is because it kind of bridges the gap between traditional manufacturing methods and mass manufacturing. And these digital fabrication machines can actually produce more unique products with less wastage than mass manufacturing. They are easier to learn so that more people have access to it. Anyone who knows how to use a computer can actually use these machines. And I'm trying not to get into it, but I am a bit passionate about these machines. So I would say that one of the ways that you can address, especially in terms of prototyping products and designs, is by taking advantage of digital fabrication as low cost, high flexibility forms of manufacturing, which is perfect for prototyping very unique products. Okay. Now, we talked about eco labels, and one case that I want to talk about specifically is actually that of packaging ink. So remember I mentioned to you that's the case of, let's say, tarpaulins. And it's been known that tarpaulins are very low cost. But the cost is that they use solvent-based inks, which release fumes. If you've ever worked in a tarpaulin shop, or if you've ever bought a tarpaulin, you'll know that they have this chemical smell to it. And this is actually a large contributor for water pollutants, especially in the Philippines. And so what's happening is businesses are actually taking a closer look at what are the effects of these inks. So what actually I want to mention, for example, is a kind of ink called Latex Ink. The idea is that they've transformed the ink, the packaging, which we often take for granted, into something that is safer to use. And when you think of ways of revolutionizing a product, the ink that we print the label of our packaging on isn't often discussed, but it's an important way of seeing just how deep and how complex and important it is to go through all of the ways to be sustainable. So, for example, these inks, these latex inks, are actually safe for use in hospitals, which is something that you can't have because of chemicals in other solvent-based inks. And the idea here is that by being more conscious of these seemingly small decisions, like what kind of ink we print packaging on, you can actually use these new technologies, these new developments that address these problems of sustainability. So latex ink, it's a interesting example of a new technology that is revolutionizing traditional methods, traditional ways of printing in a system that is often overlooked. We won't often think twice of what ink we use to print packaging. But it's an important way of seeing that sustainability has to be approached from an end-to-end solution, not just one specific part, not just visual, not just the texture or the material. You have to really look into all the aspects that make something sustainable. And with that, I would close up the last part of the presentation. Okay, so again, we looked at what are some examples of sustainability in practice. And the key point that I want to summarize this with is sustainability is a complex topic. But by breaking it down, we can look at the social, we can take a look at the economic and the environmental aspect. It's easier for us to examine products, services, or things in a sustainable framework. Second, implementing sustainability is all about looking at every single part of your product or service, from its conception all the way to its disposal. Every part can be framed in terms of sustainability. And sustainability has to be seen from all parts in order to be truly sustainable. Because not being able to address one part of the problem is imbalancing that aspect of sustainability. Okay, so I think it's 5:40, which should leave us just enough time for Q&A.
The floor is now open to your questions, but since we already have questions earlier, I'll read them out loud now.
Sure.
So we have one from Rafa. How to address a sustainable education of the deaf with your presentation?
Okay.
That's the
Now,
first.
first is that, with anything, it's important to understand situation. So I would have to say education of the deaf, I feel like is something I would need more information on. But I would say you can look more into the social aspect. It could be the perception of playing up the importance and the role of education for the deaf, meaning making sure that people are more aware of the needs and the attention that it has. Awareness is one part I would say that you can look into. Because sustainability, it also includes the fact that people have to view it as important in order to give it value. So the more people are able to understand that this is an important part that needs to be addressed, it helps sustain that movement and motion. So if you'd like to talk about the idea more, you're very welcome, Rafa. Since probably more information on it would be easier to address. Although it is kind of fair. Sustainability is a bit tough for more abstract concepts like education. So there.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. Digital tech. Yeah. Again, on the topic of accessibility, I'm not as familiar with how education for the deaf functions and the specifics of the requirements, but well, we see here a lot of technologies that are working out, and there are many inventions that are being developed from like an industrial scale, even from hobbyists, to find ways, for example, for signing to be digitized. It's a cool concept, and I've seen a lot of attempts, like with gloves, some using AI computers that can actually read it. But the idea is that there are technologies that are moving towards there, and I think that the more people work on and see how we can apply those technologies, I think the more that we can develop it. It's an interesting thing that we can look at, and it's a developing field.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Our next question is from Alma. Do small and medium-sized enterprises prepare sustainability reports?
Okay, so I think this one depends more on local regulation, but I believe that at the moment in the Philippines, it's not a requirement. It's more of following to codes for, let's say, manufacturing or civil codes. But one thing that I could encourage is that taking initiative on framing these reports. For example, it's not required, but you can choose to already prepare documents and present it, is one way of expressing that your brand or your business is conscious and is looking to be involved. Because transparency has a way of also implying responsibility for a business. And oftentimes, small businesses think it's not important or it's irrelevant, but it could be a way to differentiate you from other competitors. So it's one way of looking at it. It doesn't always have to be a requirement for you to do, but it could be a way that you can take the initiative and maybe influence change amongst other businesses.
Mm-hmm. From Diamond, she asked, some company products are considered sustainable, and sometimes due to it being sustainable, it also becomes more costly compared to alternative non-sustainable products. With this, how can some switch to sustainable products if they cannot afford it?
Okay, so multiple parts. First recommendation I could have is regulation. Government incentives for sustainable businesses is starting. There are investors who are looking to promote more sustainable practice. So on a business and economic standpoint, that's one of the things that can be considered. But again, like I said, it is a challenge with sustainability. Cost is important, and you can look into other technologies, such as maybe exploring different materials, exploring different manufacturing process that may help offset these costs. You may look into marketing that may capitalize more on the branding. But I would say, no, there is no magical answer to solve this cost problem. And in some ways, it's a reality that might have to be faced, because cheap production is cheap, but it comes at the cost of waste. It comes at the cost of overproduction. And so it's also a matter of educating and seeing the value of these products beyond just their nominal cost. So it's definitely a challenge. And it is very much true that many sustainable products are a lot more expensive.
Thank you. Carlos has a question. He raised his hand. You can go right ahead and unmute yourself, Carlos.
Okay. Good afternoon, Sir Gids and Pat. I have a question. How is sustainability affected during this pandemic ever since last year?
Okay. Specifically in what way, if I would ask? Because or just in general for the pandemic?
Yes, just in general.
Okay. One way I would say that a lot of services that were stopped waste disposal became a bit of an issue on the onset of the pandemic, meaning the safety of waste disposal as a function. It showed the importance and also how underdeveloped it is in the Philippines. We rely on more local strategies for waste disposal, and there's no large-scale infrastructure to accommodate it. Second, I guess this is more obvious for us as consumers, the delivery economy has created this influx of businesses that import and resell, which creates an influx of products that result to waste. In turn, more products and more delivery also means there's an influx in terms of packaging. Because the priority has always been economic first, packaging is primarily for making sure it fits regulation, making sure there's enough plastic that it doesn't get wet so the customer is not upset. But there are developments into ways that we can make packaging more efficient, ways that we use less plastic to meet the same kind of requirements and demands. Many businesses right now, for example, they buy their products, but their packaging they outsource. They buy a bulk boxes or bulk plastics from a supplier. This can lead to many issues, especially when their products are more customized. So there is a need for more customized and personalized packaging. But because of the limitations of Philippines being primarily an import economy, a lot of the challenges have been getting that kind of sourcing. And in terms of availability has also been an issue. Just some examples, I'm sure that's not all of them, but those are just some.
Was your question answered, Carlos?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, our next question is from Luis. In a consumer point of view, what if we have no choice to purchase items from companies that do not practice sustainability? How can we adjust or apply sustainability as a consumer?
Okay. We won't get into the topic of responsibility of a corporation versus an individual, but as a consumer, if you have to buy products, and I would say it's a reality, there are some products that really are a necessity. Following one, buying only what you need, meaning not promoting wastage is important. It also depends on the disposal and being more conscious of how you dispose and plan of the product. It's also kind of worth it to look into alternatives, meaning is there different products you can buy that might be a cheaper option? Is there ways that you can reduce how much you buy? In reality, it is difficult. As a consumer, we're kind of at the bottom end of the decision-making process. And in many cases, the reality is that larger businesses and manufacturers have the control and have the responsibility for sustainability. So unfortunately, as a consumer with no interaction to the higher processes up there, there's not a lot we can do. We can continue to do our responsibility as an individual, but the onus really has to fall on the larger corporations. One thing I try to do is I stay vocal, especially if I know that I can influence maybe these decisions, or if I'm looking for work, I try to get involved in businesses where I can make a change and finding ways that I can make those changes happen rather than relying and waiting for them. But it is difficult. I will resonate with that. There is not much an individual consumer can do in terms of sustainability for products.
Next question is from Annalie. How can we address the economic aspect so our sustainability effort can be supported? How can we lower costs of sustainable products and what makes them expensive?
Okay. Depending on the kind of product we're looking at, one of the reasons that it's often cheaper to be unsustainable is because they are mass production techniques that are very well developed. And because it's a mass production, of course, less is you produce more for less. So it's unfortunately a reality of the production process. One way to address it first is support in terms of government, meaning taxes in terms of regulation, in terms of import and fees. There are different projects and modes that the government can support more sustainable efforts. This can range all the way from innovating products. For example, there are grants by DTI for revolutionary new products that they can support the development. There are also movements by DTI to support more local products to be promoted. The cost, it's tough. It really depends on the product. But one of the things you can do is take inspiration, for example, cocoa fiber. They look at low value materials like cocoa fiber and found new ways to apply it using new technologies. We can try looking at new technological inventions and applying them to seemingly low value materials that are abundant. For example, bamboo. One of the growing developments here in the Philippines is they have bamboo farms and they're looking to make engineered bamboo, which previously was only done in other countries because it's an advanced process. But we're turning these low value materials and adding value to it, which means that it's cheaper to source, but the output still has high value. So it's a very complex question, and there's a lot of factors that go into it. And I hope those are some of the ways that it can be addressed. Not all, and it really takes a lot of research and effort for you to truly, integrate sustainability. It's not easy.
Okay. Sir, kaya pa? Do you want to take
I think we have time
water?
for one more. No, we're good.
Okay. So Jamila asked, how to determine if a certain product is sustainable if it has not acquired a certification?
Okay. Depending on the kind of product and how much effort you want to put, it's sometimes as simple as talking to the supplier. Asking questions is one of the best ways to find out directly. I would say even certification in certain ways can't always be trusted. Again, with the number of eco labels around, it's kind of difficult. But taking time to learn about the brand, learn about what is their production process, where they source the materials. If they are conscious of being sustainable, then it's likely that they will market that and capitalize on it as a business. So taking some time to look into and research about the products you consume, the manufacturing process, the impact and effects that it has is one good way of understanding. It's not easy and it certainly takes more effort. But if you really want to stay conscious about sustainability, if you want to know that your products are good, then it does take effort on your part to research and look into those things. And sometimes asking questions about the supplier is simple enough. If they're not sustainable and they're kind of vague and sketchy about their answers, then you can kind of understand that maybe they don't have it as their goal and it might be worth looking into alternatives. Because I know there are a lot of brands that invest a lot of money and time to being sustainable. A lot of alternatives. So there.
Okay, I think we have one last question. From Ray, what are some ways or practices that sustainability can be achieved in the scenario where your product or service is software, or at least improve sustainability in business processes during lockdown when most interactions are done online and Wi-Fi and electricity become more important?
Mm-hmm. I would say for this kind of question, it's specific to your industry, specific to software. And I'm sure you're more familiar with the challenges that go into it. So I would say, I don't think I could recommend like a solid solution or a way to you since I don't have as much information, but I would go back and go to the process from your conceptualization to prototyping to how you distribute. That's one way you can look at sustainability. I would say, actually, a reflection of what you said would be, in a way, interactions done online is a form of sustainability. I mean, if you think about it, the need for offices for a business such as software wasn't necessary. The need for meeting in person or having, spending money to buy lunch with a client, it's not always important. And in some ways, this ability to communicate with someone by just having an internet connection is a form of being more sustainable because more people have access to your product. It's easier, safer for you to communicate, and it's more convenient. So it's one way to see that in online interactions is a form of sustainability, leveraging the technology to make it easier. But to look more into how software design or your product service can be made sustainable, I'm not an expert. So it would be something that you can go back and examine the way the process that your software is developed. And it's not an easy answer. And it really is something that we'll have to look into. So that's what I would advise. Going back and kind of breaking down your product or service and seeing where you can make changes that promote sustainability in both social, economic, and environmental aspect. Because sometimes one is easier to see than the others.
All right. Thank you, sir. And thank you, everyone, for sending in your questions. We have a lot. So that means they were really interested. They were really engaged. Thank you.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
So now we would like to ask for your feedback and comments about this afternoon's social innovation talk. We are sending the feedback link in the chat box. We would also like to invite you to sit with us once again on October 27 as we talk about living in the fourth industrial wall revolution. Again, we will be with Sir Gideon. Yay! You'll
One
also
more.
see you'll also see our upcoming events for November in the link that we sent. So you may register here at the link in the chat box. And if you have any more questions, feel free to connect with us at the link that's going to be sent in the chat box.
Okay.
Okay.
I want to say thank you for everyone here, the audience for being here, for listening. I know it's a lot to take in, but it's good to be conscious. And so even being present and wanting to learn more about sustainability is a very good move. For the organizers, thank you. For FSL team members, I hope it was okay to keep up. I understand I can sometimes talk pretty fast. So thank you very much for your hard work. Yeah.
All right. So one last QR code. You can scan what we are showing right now or visit our website at campsite.bio/Benilde HIFI to see our social platforms like LinkedIn, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and our Medium blog. Thank you. Thank you once again, Sir Gideon, Accelerating Makers, and the HIFI team for making this social innovation talk possible. And of course, to you, our dear audience, for joining us this afternoon. Once again, this has been Pat Cabansay, your host for this afternoon. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you again in our future events. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, sir.